So I wanted to do a series of videos on the cult NXIVM. Last week, I did a video looking at a conversation between Keith Raniere and Alison Mack. And today I want to look at the concept of collateral, how it was used within the secret group called DOS, which was the group that ultimately got the organization of NXIVM exposed. And it was mostly crimes related to DOS that got Keith Raniere thrown in prison. And as part of this series, I specifically want to look at things that people who are sort of still deeply loyal to Keith Raniere, the things that they are saying and the defenses and the justifications that they offer to support why they are still loyal to NXIVM and to Keith Raniere's kind of ideas and principles. Now, there aren't that many, as far as I can tell. I've been involved in doing quite a lot of investigation online into NXIVM over the past couple of weeks. As far as I can tell, there are not that many NXIVM loyalists left, and those that still do exist have kind of become a bit quieter. But there are like pockets of the internet where you can still find activity from these people online. And I want to look at some of those sources in a series of videos because I just think it's incredibly interesting, very fascinating to look at the thought processes of people who remain loyal to cult teachings, even in the face of such horror and criminal activity, and even in the face of their leader going to jail for, honestly, crimes that are just incredibly heartbreaking. I've watched both The Vow and Seduced, which is a documentary that India Oxenberg put out about her story, her time in NXIVM and in DOS, because she was a DOS slave. It's really, really heartbreaking. As I say, I've watched it a few times and I found it to be a very tough watch, very emotional, very wrenching, really. But it is a fascinating look. It's a very hard-hitting look into the inner workings of the organization and how a person goes from being someone who is, relatively kind of happy-go-lucky, very privileged, successful, and, someone who seems to have all the trappings of a good life from the outside. And I looked at this briefly and I spoke about this in my last video when I was referring to Alison Mack, who was in a similar sort of position, very attractive, successful, wealthy, seemed to have just so much going for her. And India Oxenberg, arguably in a similar position, she came from a very prominent family, came from a lot of wealth, beautiful girl, very successful in many ways, or at least had a lot going for her in many ways. And yet there was something about NXIVM that drew her in. And this sort of the transformation that takes place over a period of time is just, it's interesting and fascinating and also very horrifying, but it's something that I feel moved to kind of talk about and look into, because I think it's important for all of us to know about the ways in which we can be unduly influenced and about the ways in which we can get lured and sort of sucked into quite destructive ways of thinking and behaving. And so that's kind of my motivation for doing this series of videos. Today, I want to look at a very interesting concept that was used to devastating effect within the DOS sort of secret group of women, and that is the concept of collateral. Now, collateral is something that apparently was borrowed from Keith Raniere's main NXIVM teachings, and it's something that was used within the secret society of DOS masters and slaves. And if you don't know much about these terms and how they were used within DOS, I strongly recommend going and watching The Vow and Seduced, because, it will help you to get a sort of very clear understanding of these concepts and how they were used, and, really how people were exploited using the concept of master and slave. You would think that would be pretty obvious just from the word master and slave, but it just goes to kind of show you how much people's thinking had been tampered with, that the terms master and slave didn't seem to set off big enough alarm bells for people like Alison Mack and India Oxenberg and many other women who were lured into this group. But anyway, I want to look at the concept of collateral, because collateral was really, to me, the linchpin that kept people in DOS, even when they must have seen that the things going on inside this group were extremely wrong, and when they must have been feeling the negative impact of being involved in this group. And, they must have had very grave concerns, I imagine, yet the concept of collateral was kind of pivotal to keeping them inside the group. And I want to look at just a little bit about how the idea of collateral was twisted and abused and taken advantage of in order for Keith Raniere and even the upper echelon of this group to wield ultimate control over the people inside the group. Collateral was a concept that was linked to the idea of penance, which is another idea used in the NXIVM group. And again, these words, these terms as I say them, give me such a creepy feeling. It's just so kind of distasteful and horrifying and disgusting to me that grown adults who are seeking to better themselves and who are seeking to do good in the world are being leveraged using things like penance and collateral. Kind of reminds me of sort of more fundamental puritanical forms of Christianity, where the whole concept of punishment is linked to the idea of virtue. Like, the more that you suffer, the better you are as a person. It shows your devotion. I do think this is a concept in NXIVM that was borrowed from fundamental Christianity. And we'll see that as we sort of look a little bit more at the concept of collateral. The concept of you're worthless and you're constantly sinning and you're constantly doing things that you shouldn't be doing and that are wrong. And so these feelings of guilt and shame are very much baked into the ideology of the group. So before we kind of look at the source that I want to look at today, let's just quickly go over what collateral was and how it was used within this secret group. So in general, the concept of collateral is something that secures a person performing a particular action. So if I promise to pay back a friend who has loaned me some money, I could offer up a valuable asset of mine as collateral for the repayment of that loan, meaning that if I don't pay the loan back, my friend has a certain right to this valuable asset that I have pledged as collateral for the repayment of the loan. It's kind of a way of ensuring that I keep my word, that I do what I say I'm going to do. And it sounds okay when I explain it like that, when I define it like that. But when we look at how collateral was practiced within the DOS group, it quickly takes a very dark turn. So members of DOS were asked to pledge collateral before they were even given any information about what the group even was. So how it would work, and we have numerous women confirming that this is how things happened. How it would work is that someone who was already in DOS would approach a new recruit, someone that they wanted to recruit into DOS, and they would say, I have this really unique and special opportunity to offer you, this group, which will really help you to get to the next level in your personal development, or it'll help you to get promoted in the organization. It'll help you with various ambitious goals that you're trying to achieve. I want to invite you to join this group, but I can't tell you any more until you pledge a certain amount of collateral. And the collateral had to be something that was damaging or harmful to the reputation or position or life of the person who was pledging the collateral. So the more damage or harm that could be done via the collateral, the better the collateral was considered to be. So examples of collateral that people were asked to pledge were nude photos of themselves, or perhaps a sexually explicit video. Or other examples of collateral they were asked to give were, or that they gave, were letters giving very private and potentially very damning information about loved ones, their spouse, their family, friends, people that they cared about. They even, when it got to a point that they didn't know what kind of collateral to give, they would even make up things that were completely untrue about loved ones. We have examples of women saying that they ended up writing a letter accusing parents of abusing them or their spouse of being violent, things that weren't even true, things that were lies, just in order to give collateral that was kind of damaging and damning enough to satisfy the senior people in DOS. And ultimately, it was Keith Raniere who was deciding whether or not the collateral was intense enough and extreme enough. And I have to say, it's even kind of upsetting talking about this, because the nature of this collateral was really so abusive and so honestly just, it hurts me to think that people were using their friendships and relationships within the organization in order to extract this extremely vulnerable and damaging information from people. It's just really awful. Other examples of collateral that they were asked to give were like PIN codes to their bank accounts or the deeds to their house. They were asked to sign them over to their master before they would be allowed to progress to the next level within DOS. Or it actually got to the point where members of DOS were being asked to give collateral every single month. So it wasn't enough just to give collateral just to enter the group, but by the end, they were being asked to give collateral on a monthly basis. And India Oxenberg and others talk about the fact that eventually they just started to run out of collateral to give. So they were told by their masters to just make things up. But the key part about it is that the collateral had to be damaging and, particularly damning so that it was something that they never wanted to be released or to ever be used against them. It's very heartbreaking actually listening to India Oxenberg talking about her collateral in Seduced and how, she was terrified that Alison Mack was going to use it to hurt her. And let's face it, why would Alison and Keith and the other sort of masters of DOS, why would they have asked for this collateral if it wasn't meant to instill fear in the DOS slaves? So in any case, that's what collateral was. It was this damaging information or, damaging assets or important resources that people in DOS were asked to hand over to the senior members. And ultimately, it all ended up in Keith Raniere's possession. So that's sort of a bit of background about what collateral was. Now, the source that I want to look at is actually a blog article written by women who still claim to be in DOS and loyal to the whole concept of the DOS group, if you can believe that. The senior members of DOS, most of them have been prosecuted and have faced some sort of punishment, but there is like a tiny handful of women who still remain loyal to the concept of DOS and who seem to still be in these master-slave relationships. We don't really know the specifics of it. We only know what this group has made public. So the group is actually called the Dossier Project, and they're still deeply brainwashed, still deeply loyal to NXIVM, to Keith Raniere, and to the ideology of DOS. It's all very, very disturbing, but I want to pull back the cover on all of this and just bring it into the light, because I do think that it is valuable for us to talk about. So what we're going to look at is actually an essay, a blog article essay that was written by the Dossier Project about collateral and sort of them trying to dispel some of the myths around collateral and essentially defending the concept of collateral, which I think most people would agree is pretty indefensible. When you hear about it first, you're like, that is just horrifying. The idea that people had to hand over this collateral is just, it's absolutely horrific. And so people who are still deeply brainwashed feel the need to defend it and to explain it and to try and make it seem not so bad. And I think it's fascinating the way that they do this. And so we're going to look at it. Let's pull up the article. So it's called Collateral Essay. I'm going to read the article and I'm going to be stopping it along the way to comment on just the way things are being twisted. Hopefully it's clear enough when I'm reading and when I'm commenting. But I've put the article up on the screen so you can follow along if you want. Okay, so Collateral Essay, Dossier Project. As I say, there is this group called the Dossier Project. They have a website called dossierproject.love. It's very interesting. There's not that much information on it. I think, as I said earlier, a lot of these NXIVM loyalists have gone underground. They've kind of seem to be keeping a low profile these days, but there is still these bits and pieces that exist online. Okay, so Collateral Essay. I'm going to start reading the article now. As I say, hopefully it's clear enough when I'm reading and when I'm commenting. So one of the most controversial aspects of DOS, at least as it is portrayed in the media and by a handful of former DOS members, is the concept of collateral. Okay, first of all, I just think it's interesting that they say at least as it's portrayed in the media and by a handful of former DOS members. I think most people would consider collateral to be one of the most controversial aspects of DOS. I don't think that's just an opinion by the media and a handful of former DOS members. I think that's a pretty widely held opinion, first of all. So I think what I might do in order to differentiate between when I'm reading from the article and when I'm commenting is I'll knock on the table twice to signal that I'm stopping reading. That's something Mac Attack does. I love Mac Attack, and I think it's very handy. So that's what I'm going to do. And when I start reading again, I will knock twice. While the traditional definition of collateral is straightforward, something pledged as security for repayment of a loan to be forfeited in the event of a default, Oxford Languages Dictionary, the word has taken on a dark and sinister meaning due to the erroneous association with blackmail within the concept of DOS. So it's interesting here that they're talking about collateral being erroneously seen as blackmail. Well, I don't think that there's too many other ways to think of it. Why else would you ask for collateral unless you were holding the threat of releasing that collateral over the head of the person providing it? I mean, I don't think it's at all erroneous to link blackmail and collateral. It's very clear that the giving of collateral was meant to instill fear into the DOS slaves. It was meant to make them afraid of that collateral ever being made public. It's driven by fear, which is at the heart of what blackmail is. So yeah, it's fascinating to me how they are somehow trying to say that the collateral is not blackmail when it's very clear that it is. In order for something to be blackmail, it has to be extortion or coercion by threats, especially of public exposure or criminal prosecution. So I think that it is very clear that the collateral that was used in DOS was extortion and coercion by threats. Clearly, even if the collateral wasn't, even if it wasn't overtly threatened that the collateral would be released, I think it is logical to assume that the members of DOS feared that their collateral would be released if they didn't comply with the dictates of the DOS group. The key word here is threat. Despite all the testimony from alleged victims in documentaries about NXIVM and a 6-week criminal trial, not a single woman has claimed that they were actually threatened with the release of collateral. First, I really take issue with their use of the word alleged in front of victims. I don't think it's for them to say that the victims were alleged. I think it is patently obvious through the multitude of evidence that we have seen that Keith Raniere victimized a great many people, and I don't think that those are alleged victims. I think it has been proven beyond a doubt that there were victims, and there were many people who were victimized in a very horrific way. And secondly, where they say that not a single woman has claimed they were actually threatened with the release of collateral, that is just a lie. That is a bold-faced lie. We have multiple women in both the Vow and the Seduce documentaries specifically saying that they were threatened with the release of their collateral. So that's just a lie for them to say that not a single woman has claimed they were actually threatened with the release of collateral. India Oxenberg says that she was threatened with the release of her collateral many times, and a number of the other DOS women say that as well. And that threat of the release of the collateral kept them in the group a lot longer than they wanted to be there. This means that any agreement where a surety is pledged to back a commitment can be deemed blackmail. So if someone pledges a house as collateral to get a loan and defaults on that loan, and the bank comes for the house, then the individual can claim that they're being blackmailed. This obviously wouldn't hold up in court, yet it follows the same logic as calling DOS collateral blackmail. Okay, so this is what we call a false equivalence fallacy. It's where two things are held up as if they are equivalent, when in actual fact they're nothing alike. Here, they're trying to say that the collateral that was extracted from the DOS slaves is the same as collateral that is pledged to pay back a loan for a house. Those two things are not similar at all. The one is extremely damaging to a person's reputation and the other one is not. The collateral that was extracted in DOS was usually of a sexual nature. It was of a nature that could destroy family relationships, marriages, etc. Whereas the collateral that is used to guarantee payback of a loan is of a financial nature. And, so the two are completely different. It's also not accurate to say that even the process of, threatening someone with kind of acting on their collateral is the same in the two circumstances. They're not similar at all. In the case of the DOS collateral, you're talking about information being made public that is very damaging to the person. And in the case of collateral that's being used as security for a loan, you're talking simply about the bank cashing in a right that they have to the collateral. That's not blackmail. I think it's very obvious that that's not blackmail, whereas the first instance very clearly is blackmail. It's just a complete false equivalence fallacy that they're using here. And so I also think it's very clear why the court would uphold the bank's rights in this situation, but they wouldn't uphold the rights of a person blackmailing someone using collateral, in the sense that it was used in DOS. To offer an example that might help in understanding why anyone would entrust a friend with collateral in the first place, consider the following scenario. Let's say I have a friend with a drinking problem. We'll call her Lisa. Part of Lisa's issue is that she never intends to get drunk. She'll go out for dinner, order a drink, which leads to one more until she's drunk, and then she drives home drunk. This is bad for two reasons. The first being that she breaks her word to not drink, but more practically, she puts herself and others in danger by driving while intoxicated. When she's sober, she is horrified by her behavior and vows to never do it again. However, she has proven that she doesn't have the strength to make better decisions under certain circumstances. So, desperate to not drive drunk, Lisa asks me for help. We're going out for dinner and she gives me the keys to her car. First things first, we'll deal with the drinking problem later, and says, no matter what I say, I do not give me my car keys to drive home tonight. Despite her good intentions, she knows there's a good chance she'll get drunk and she doesn't want to put herself in that position. I agree to take the keys and hold them for safekeeping. We go out. She predictably gets drunk and in her intoxicated state demands that I give her the keys so she can drive home. She assures me she's fine to drive, even though she's obviously slurring, and says, if you don't give me my keys, I'm calling the cops. I don't hand over the keys. Lisa says, I'm going to tell them that you stole my car. She actually goes as far as calling the cops, and then they show up. And when they show up, she yells and screams that I stole her car. Now, did I steal the car, or was there a good faith agreement that under the circumstances, the act of keeping the keys was, 1, in her best interests, and 2, appropriate behavior based on the mutual agreement we made? Another false equivalence fallacy. You're talking in this situation, in this example that they've given, about a friend who has a drinking problem, and you are holding their keys in order to keep your friends safe and also to keep safe other people on the roads who could be harmed by this person driving whilst they're drunk. That is a very, very different situation than what we're talking about when we're talking about people in DOS who were kind of collateralized over things such as losing weight, sticking to an exercise regime, having sex with Keith Raniere. These are the sorts of actions that DOS members were collateralized against. And failure to comply with these requirements was threatened. They were threatened with the release of their collateral, or their collateral was held over their heads. Now, none of those things are actually about the safety of the person or about the safety of others, or are even in that person's own best interests necessarily. They're about the requirements and the demands of the group and what is good for the leader of the group. It has nothing to do with the best interests of the person. And furthermore, driving drunk is actually a crime. So by not giving your friend their keys to drive their car whilst they're drunk, you are protecting them from committing a crime which could hurt them and a lot of other people. Whereas, as I say, the sorts of actions and behaviors that were collateralized within DOS only served the interests of the group a lot of the time, or of the leader of the group, and not necessarily the interests of the person. And that's the major difference. Behaviors that were actually very harmful to the person were collateralized. And they were things which, a friend should never have control over. I would never, ever want a friend to have control over things such as how much I eat or what I eat. It's one thing for me to say, look, I'm trying to give up sugar, for instance, because I feel that sugar is bad for my health, and to say to my friend, please help me to stay on track with sugar, with not eating sugar. If you see me eating sugar, please try to discourage me from doing it. That's one thing. But it's another thing to say, well, if I have sugar, you can take nude photos of me and do something which would be very damaging and harmful to me. Like, you can see how that's abusive and harmful. It's not at all the same scenario as what they're talking about here with the friend who wants to drive drunk. You might say, but keeping the keys was obviously for the person's safety and can be easily explained to the authorities. The same is true for DOS. At the start of the e-media campaign against DOS, local authorities declined to get involved because it was obvious that consenting adults were making their own decisions. I think it is incredibly clear to anyone who has looked into this situation that this was not true consent. This was a very clear case of coercion and of people who were not in their right thinking minds, people whose thinking had been severely tampered with, and people who had been brainwashed and mind controlled over often a long period of time, and who had been threatened and manipulated to agree to these terms. That is not true consent. The Northern District of New York, which would have been the correct jurisdiction for any FBI investigation, also declined to get involved for the same reasons. NXIVM even hired a private company of former law enforcement to investigate the situation and determine if any laws were being broken, and the answer was a resounding no. So I think it's worth commenting that NXIVM is kind of notorious for doing that, for hiring their own experts that they themselves paid, often, big amounts of money to support the things that they were doing. We have just multiple examples of NXIVM doing that, hiring experts to come to the conclusion that what they were doing was actually okay. Now, I think it's very, very debatable whether you can actually trust those reports, of experts that NXIVM had paid to investigate. But this is something that cults do to lend themselves legitimacy sometimes. They will hire their own experts to sort of quote unquote investigate. And what do you know? The experts very often come to the conclusion that what the organization is doing is perfectly fine. Within DOS, none of the women felt coerced or were heard complaining about their commitment. Another lie. I mean, we have women who have left DOS, saying very clearly that they felt coerced and that if they didn't complain, it was because they felt like they couldn't complain because it was thrown back in their faces and they were minimized and belittled and shamed and criticized anytime they complained or had, were pushed back against any of these measures. They were made to feel like it was their problem and not a problem with the rules. So that's just false to say that the women didn't feel coerced or that they didn't complain. It's just an out and out lie. By that point, DOS had existed for over 2 years. When the rumor that the FBI was investigating DOS started circulating by way of Catherine Oxenberg threatening her daughter, women in DOS were surprised, but not that worried. That's not true either. Catherine Oxenberg didn't threaten her daughter. Catherine Oxenberg is seen explaining many times that it was the organization that she was trying to take down. She was doing everything in her power to make sure that her daughter didn't fall into the firing line when the DOS group was being investigated by authorities and was eventually dismantled by the authorities. Catherine Oxenberg went to great lengths to warn India about the danger that she was in, and she tried her very best to save and protect India from being prosecuted and, to just try to get her to see what she was involved in. So that's just not true. The DOS women genuinely believed that they would simply explain the whole situation, show all the evidence that proved the agreement was voluntary and collateral was never used outside the scope of the agreement, and that the whole media narrative was just one big misunderstanding. Were we naive? Yes, most definitely. Were we ill-informed about how powerful people can weaponize the media and the justice system? Absolutely. Did we make mistakes? Of course. But never ever was collateral used to harm anyone, nor was it ever released to the public. I think it's interesting that they're using words like naive and misunderstanding and ill-informed. It makes it all seem very kind of innocent. It makes it seem like the whole thing was like, oh, well, we were just doing this thing and we didn't see anything wrong with it, and we were just sure that everyone else would also come to their senses. I just don't buy that personally. I think that the things that were going on in DOS, the sex trafficking, the branding, the starvation of women, the coercion of women to have sex with Keith, all this sort of thing, the penances, the punishments, the collateral, I think that they must have known. And definitely we hear that there were people in DOS who definitely did know that what they were doing was not innocent. It was heading into very, very dangerous territory. There were a lot of people who saw red flags with what was going on. And it wasn't just about being naive and ill-informed and making mistakes. It went way beyond that point. And so I just think this is very disingenuous to try and characterize it in this way. Women who joined DOS did so of their own volition and for a specific stated purpose. Well, as we have seen already, and what we can see from the documentaries and what women who were in DOS have shared, they actually didn't know what they were joining when they were invited to join DOS. They were only told what the group actually was after they had already handed over collateral. So to say that they joined of their own volition is very misleading. Because whilst, yes, they said, I want to join, they didn't fully know what it was that they were joining or what the rules were or, what that group would actually involve until they had already handed over damning collateral. So it's this is a good example of how the truth and reality is distorted by cults. It's twisted to say, well, you chose this. This was, this was you. You made this decision. You agreed to this, didn't you? But it's all the concept of informed consent and of, agreeing to something is twisted because information is withheld and only released on the group's terms and conditions. That purpose was to enter into an agreement whereupon they would be held accountable by their master, the woman who invited her, to complete practices, follow through on goals, accept feedback, and work to become a better version of herself with her master's full support and guidance. If this is such a good thing, I really have to question why the terms master and slave were even used. If if the ultimate goal was not to subjugate women and to bring them under control and to gain dominance over them, why were the terms master and slave even used? Why was, if this was really about just completing goals and about living a more purposeful life, why wasn't the group structured in an equal way? That's what I'd like to know. The assumption was that someone joining DOS felt limited in certain areas of her life and believed that a bold commitment and guidance from a trusted friend would help her overcome those challenges. Except that the woman's master wasn't really only her friend. She was more like someone who told her what to do and had power and control over her. It was made very clear if you listen to the way that the women who were in DOS talked about it, that the relationship between the master and the slave was very much about dominance and control. It wasn't just friendship. And that dominance and control was a big part of it. India Oxenberg talks about being pressured by Alison Mack to recruit her own slaves and to be hard on them and to have this dominating relationship over them. So the attempt here to characterize this as just friendship is just a complete distortion of the truth. No one's collateral was ever at risk of being released if she didn't complete a task or failed to do a practice. Well, we don't know that because certainly what we do know is that women said that they were threatened with the release of the collateral. So we don't know how likely it was that the collateral was ever going to be released. And frankly, none of us know whatever became of the women's collateral. We do know that the FBI is sort of still holding a lot of that collateral as evidence because a lot of it was handed over to them in order to prosecute Keith Raniere and other members of NXIVM. But we don't really know what has become of the rest of the collateral or whether it ever is at risk of being released. None of us know. So, forgive me if I don't really want to take their word for it that the collateral is never at risk of being released. We just simply don't know that. As testified at trial, the worst punishment for failing to complete a task or command was doing things like a 1-minute plank or the master taking on a consequence like a cold shower. Yes, you read that right. The master would sometimes take on consequences to teach how a person's failures doesn't just affect them, it affects others too. So, grammar. Okay, first of all, I don't think that is the worst punishment that slaves were given. We know that women in DOS were being starved. They were being forced to subsist on diets of less than 1,000 calories a day. We have India Oxenberg saying that she was being asked to live on 500 calories a day at one point. She was given a goal weight of 106 pounds. I looked that up. That is 48 kilos. 48 kilos was what I weighed when I think I was maybe 14 or 15 years old. And I'm quite a sort of slight petite person. That is very, very skinny. And for someone like India Oxenberg, who I think is taller than I am, to be expected to weigh 106 pounds is just, absolutely, horrific. So they were being forced to eat very, very low calorie diets. I would argue that that's a form of punishment. We know also from India Oxenberg that she was asked to do things like stand in the snow at 3 o'clock in the morning. She was asked to send explicit pictures to Keith Raniere. He would text her and ask her to pull over whilst she was driving and send him explicit pictures. So I think, what they're saying here, that the worst punishment that they ever got was being asked to do a 1-minute plank. That's just a lie. And then the other thing I wanted to comment on was where they said the master had to take on a consequence like a cold shower. We do know that this happened, that sometimes masters had to take on a punishment if their slave failed to complete a task. And I think in a funny kind of way, this is its own form of emotional abuse, because you're essentially projecting guilt onto the slave, saying, well, look what your master now has to endure because you failed at this particular task. And so, the guilt and the shame was its own sort of punishment, and honestly, very manipulative, very emotionally abusive. I just, I mean, also, just things don't really work that way. That's not how real world consequences work. I mean, it's all very artificial. They're saying that it was to teach the idea of your actions having consequences for other people. Well, these aren't children. We aren't talking about, teaching little children right and wrong. We're talking about grown adults, and you know, it's supposed to be about their goals and their sort of life purpose. Why are we treating them like they're children? It's very, very infantilizing. Most persons' failures doesn't just affect them, it affects others too. Sorry, I've read that. Most of the time, it was the person who failed who chose her own consequence in order to fix the mistake, not the master, always with the intention of learning, growing, and building conscience. Well, India Oxenberg actually contradicts that. She said that a lot of the time it was Allison who chose her penances and the consequences if she didn't complete a task. We actually have footage in the documentary of emails that Allison would send to India, and emails that India had to send back to her, sort of showing what penances she'd completed and what penances she had to complete. So that clearly is also a distortion of the truth, what they're saying here, that it was the person themselves who had to choose the consequence. But even if they did have to choose their own consequence, I mean, how is this really voluntary if there's already so much guilt and shame and coercion taking place? I just don't accept that the person is in their right thinking mind when they are going through with these so-called penances and punishments. It's just, you can't convince me that this is all done of their own free will. Much of the time, masters and slaves lived in different homes, different cities, even different countries. Well, that is true. A lot of the time they did live completely separately, although India Oxenberg and Alison Mack did live together for much of the time. So that wasn't always the case. And a lot of the time, it seems, especially with the sort of members of the inner circle of NXIVM, that they all lived fairly close together. So even though they might not have been living in the exact same house, they all would have been living within a fairly small distance of one another, and they would have been running in the same circles. So there was that kind of spying on one another there was a certain amount of that would have taken place. I have no doubt of that. It would have been easy to lie about taking on a consequence or admitting a failure, but we trusted each other, and it was for the woman's own benefit, not the master's. Well, this is something we also see in high control groups. They'll say, oh, well, the person chose it and they don't have to do it. If they don't do it, who's really going to know? It's for their own benefit, and it's not for the benefit of the group. It's up to the individual whether they want to do it or not. But what this fails to take into account is the power of brainwashing and mind control. See, in a cult, in a damaging high control group, it gets to the point where rules don't even really have to be enforced, because people become their own jailer. They become their own prison guards. They keep themselves imprisoned because the prison is inside here. It doesn't actually have to come with physical consequences or with people actually physically forcing you to do things. It doesn't even have to come with someone telling you to do something or not do something. The prison is inside your own mind, and that's what makes it so destructive, and that's what makes it so hard to break free of and deprogram from, because you can be removed from the other people in the cult, and you can even be out of the group, and you can still be trapped by the mind control that you have undergone, the brainwashing that you have endured. And that's why you have people like this who have not woken up yet, who are still enthralled to Keith Raniere and to the group, even though he's in prison now. And this is why it's taken some people who have woken up from NXIVM a long time to actually wake up, and to kind of deprogram. Deprogramming is a whole process because the damage has been done to the person's mind. So this is a misrepresentation of the truth, what they're saying here. This dynamic is similar to an athlete trusting a coach to push them and direct them to do practices that help build the strength needed for success. We all have moments when we feel lazy, afraid, or lose sight of our vision, and if we aren't careful, our life can pass us by while we're lost in our excuses and distractions. The intent of DOS was to help women build their inner strength required to stay focused, to not give in to fear, and to understand the responsibility of being a leader, whether that's in a company, a family, or any other setting. We are all leaders in our own lives. The question is, where are we leading to? Even answering that question was something a DOS master would help facilitate. Honest feedback from people outside of our circumstances is necessary to gain perspective. It's often the case that our immediate family and friends don't want to tell us the hard truths, lest it disrupt a relationship. Therefore, the commitment in DOS was to provide honest, constructive feedback with the goal of personal growth, self-awareness, and self-love. Okay, a couple things here, just to try not to repeat myself, but a couple of things I did just want to mention with this paragraph is, firstly, we have another false equivalence fallacy, comparing the relationship between a DOS master and slave to a coach and an athlete. Clearly, the two are very different. A coach is being paid by the athlete or being employed to help the athlete to achieve certain athletic goals. And whilst, yes, the relationship between a coach and an athlete can become abusive, it can become exploitative, and it can become problematic, at the same time, there are boundaries to that relationship. It's governed within a certain context, whereas a DOS master had license to take over virtually every area of a DOS slave's life. So there were no boundaries, there were no limitations, there were no kind of um, restrictions on what a DOS master could do. A coach is also it's a different the nature of a coaching relationship is different. A coach is not there to tell the athlete what to do. They're there to guide them and advise them. Whereas a DOS master was very much had a very much a sort of a dominating, coercive, controlling relationship with the slave. Hence the terms master and slave. That's the first thing. The second thing is they talk about you could provide honest, constructive feedback. But it seemed like that honest, constructive feedback only happened one way, and that was from the master to the slave. It seemed like the slave wasn't allowed to give honest, constructive feedback to the master, because we have multiple examples that were mentioned in both The Vow and Seduced, where slaves attempted to give their master feedback or tried to, offer criticisms or complain about things or say that they didn't agree with certain things. And they were shouted down and made to feel inferior, made to feel shamed, told that their opinions were not valid or, not their opinions sort of didn't matter. So apparently the feedback was only ever worked one way, from a master to a slave, and not from a slave to the master. And that, by the way, is one of the ways. There are multiple ways, but this is a telltale sign of a destructive group, where feedback is only ever one way. If relationships are not equal, in other words, someone says they want honest, constructive feedback, but the feedback only happens from them to you, and you can't offer feedback from yourself to them, that is a sure sign that you are in a destructive or harmful relationship. In a truly empowered, healthy relationship, communication and honesty and feedback should go both ways and not just one way. Now back to the collateral. There are more facts that can easily debunk the distorted way it's been represented in the mainstream narrative. There are those who have claimed the collection of collateral was coercive to begin with. This can easily be debunked by the fact that there are many women who were invited to learn about DOS by giving first collateral to ensure secrecy about DOS, who declined. There are also women who gave collateral to learn about DOS and ensured secrecy, who then declined the offer to join. These women's collateral was never released nor threatened to be released, and the friendships between the women were not affected negatively. So, if that's the case, I have two questions. First of all, why did DOS need to be secret if it was so great, if it was such a wonderful, empowering, beneficial arrangement for all involved? Why did it need to be secret? Why were why were people not allowed to speak about it if there was nothing wrong with it, if there was nothing shady going on? That's the first thing. And second of all, what assurances does anyone have after they've handed over collateral that nothing will be done with that collateral? How is the person who's now given over collateral supposed to know that their collateral is not, at risk? What exactly do they say? These women's collateral is never released nor threatened to be released. Well, we only have their word for it that was the case. We don't actually know what happened to the collateral, or what could have happened to it. The only reason you would ever even ask for damaging collateral, well, I thought about another example of collateral that was given. People also gave the passwords to their social media accounts as collateral sometimes. And you can imagine how damaging that would be if it fell into the wrong hands, especially when you're talking about, well-known public figures like India Oxenberg or Nikki Klein, people who were, well-known figures in society if the passwords to their social media accounts were misused by someone. But anyway, I just wanted to make the point that really the fact that this article says that the collateral was never at risk of being released is neither here nor there, because we just don't actually know what was done with it. So how is DOS coercive if there is no negative consequence to saying no, and numerous examples of people saying no? Well, I can answer that, because coercion isn't just about negative consequences for saying no to joining. It was coercive in the sense that people's relationships and friendships were being leveraged to pressure people to join. It was coercive in the sense that a lot of times people didn't even know what they were agreeing to when they handed over the collateral. So just because some people agreed and didn't say no, it doesn't mean that it wasn't coercive. A lot of the times they thought they were agreeing to something that was going to benefit them and that was going to bring them a closer friendship with this group of women. They thought they were joining a women's empowerment group. And then when they got further and further in, that was when they were told about the more harmful aspects, like branding, like having to seduce Keith, like having to give collateral every single month, like having to live on a diet of less than 1,000 calories a day. That's what made it coercive. It was the way that information was withheld and the secrecy and the pressure to stay loyal, even after you've seen all these, horrifying things. It was assumed that the women who decided to join DOS through a lengthy and thorough process of evaluation and self-examination did so because they saw it as something they wanted. Is it possible they thought they wanted it and then changed their minds? Of course, we all do that. But that's the exact process that all too often keeps us from achieving our dreams. Our tendency to change course when things get hard is precisely what DOS was trying to address. So I'm reading between the lines of these few sentences, and essentially what I'm getting is that once you had decided to join DOS, there was no going back. You couldn't now say that you were going to change your mind or that you wanted to change your mind, even if things got revealed to you as time went on that you didn't agree with and that you thought were particularly awful. You couldn't change your mind because that just shows that you lack commitment. That's essentially what they're saying here. Even though these decisions have been made without your input, I mean, the whole idea of branding was something that Keith Raniere came up with. And then sort of between him and Allison and a couple of the high-ranking members, they sort of hashed out the details. But, the actual lower ranking members of DOS had no input into it. They just had to comply. So it's essentially what's being said here is that if they objected to anything that was being done to them or anything that they were being asked to do, they were shamed and made to feel as if they lacked commitment and as if they just couldn't stick to anything. And so they were pressured via their collateral, via their relationships with other women in the group, via various means, coercive means, to stay in the group and to comply with these things that were escalating in intensity and getting worse and worse as time went on. And that if they said no to anything, it was just a sign of their issue and of their failure to be loyal and to commit. In life, there are many points where we can either choose away from our commitments because it's uncomfortable. Oh, there's definitely grammar errors in this article. Or we can push through the discomfort and find that we are stronger on the other side. We never know everything involved in a commitment when we make it, whether that's a career, a relationship, or joining an organization. Consider the commitment to join the military. But no matter what the commitment is, a diet, a workout, a creative project, we build internal fortitude and belief in ourselves when we stay the course. DOS was about helping women stay the course, especially through the times when it's uncomfortable and challenging. Except that a lot of the things that were uncomfortable and challenging about being in DOS were things that were devised by a man who was clearly exercising control and dominance over these women, having to engage in sexual activities with Keith, having to have Keith Raniere's initials branded on their sort of pelvic regions, having to become very skinny. And notice the reference to a diet. This is something I noticed multiple times. Anytime you hear the DOS women talking about being in DOS, women who were in DOS, it's the common theme of dieting and these very disordered eating habits come through again and again and again. It's, you can't convince me. There's just absolutely no way that this was being done for the benefit of the women who were involved. It just wasn't. It was all about power and control. And it was being dressed up as being committed and showing how strong you are, when really it's just simply asking these women to submit to torture, quite frankly. Another relevant fact about the collateral is that no one who was rightfully entrusted with it ever released it to the public. Each individual master collected collateral from the women she invited, and then put it in a safe or kept it on an encrypted drive for safekeeping. Well, that's not entirely true either. As far as I understand, a lot of it wound up in Keith Raniere's possession. So it wasn't simply kept with the individual masters. It got funneled through to Keith, and he ended up keeping, I don't know how much of it or all of it. I don't know if it's possible to even know that. But we do know that Keith Raniere and Alison Mack ended up keeping a large amount of collateral of the women in the entirety of DOS. And so it's just not true that it was only kept by individual masters. This is significant because it shows that despite the agreement that the collateral was to back the commitment to secrecy on the DOS path, it was ultimately a gesture to help each woman in DOS feel a sense of gravity behind their word. Sarah Edmondson, for example, openly admits to breaking her commitment, and there were no consequences from anyone in DOS. Quite the opposite. I don't think you can really say that there were no consequences from anyone in DOS. I think Sarah Edmondson has spoken quite a lot about the pushback that she received, she and the other NXIVM defectors, the ones who were instrumental in bringing NXIVM and Keith Raniere to justice. Sarah Edmondson faced a lot of consequences for doing that. She was litigated against by NXIVM for quite a while after she left. And so there definitely were consequences to that. The smear campaign she pioneered has destroyed the lives and careers of many women she once called friends. It's so interesting, isn't it, that they characterize Sarah speaking out about her experiences and the harm that was being perpetrated in DOS. It's so interesting that they characterize that as a smear campaign, isn't it? And that, I think it's a way to try and sully the motives of Sarah and to say that, she was clearly only doing this out of hate and spite and that she couldn't possibly have had noble intentions. Others left before and after Sarah also. It was for the woman giving collateral to build strength behind her commitments and be reminded of what she once thought it was worth to her, like the sober person handing over the keys to stay the course. It was never intended nor used to coerce anyone to do something that could be harmful or beneficial to anyone else. There are former DOS members, however, who stole collateral. Jessica Joan claims in her memoir and in sworn testimony that she took screenshots of the collateral, which she was not entrusted with and should not have had access to, and shared it with her boyfriend and Mark Vicente over email in case she needed it as leverage down the line. This exposes a criminal intent on her part and also explains why her projection of the collateral would be a sinister one. What did they think was going to happen if you force people to hand over very damaging information and resources, and you force them to continue doing that, and it's shared amongst a group of people? What did they think was going to happen to it? Did they really think that it was never going to get leaked somehow, that it was never going to fall into the wrong hands, or that it was never going to get shared with people who are not supposed to see it? I mean, that's just complete, la la land thinking. And that's why it's so damaging. That's why it's so awful to force people to give collateral, because you never know whose hands it could fall into, or where it could end up, or whether it could ever end up becoming public. You just, at a certain point, you lose control over it. That's what makes it so abusive, to ask for that kind of information from someone. And I don't personally blame this woman. I don't know who Jessica Joan is. I don't even blame the women who stole collateral and thought they were doing a good thing by sort of trying to get the collateral back and handing it over to other people as protection. I can understand why fear of, being harmed or being damaged, I can understand why fear would drive them to do that. But there's no compassion coming through from this article, for what these women might have been going through. She is the only one who has released collateral, even though she was never threatened with the release of hers, nor was her collateral ever made public. However, Jessica's breach of trust has harmed many. Mark Vicente gave the collateral to Frank Parlato, and when Nicole, a woman who voluntarily left DOS without consequence in July 2017, spoke to Frank to request her name be taken off his blog, he told her he had her collateral and she should talk to Catherine Oxenberg. So while Nicole was never threatened by anyone in DOS with the release of collateral, it's possible she was coerced after she left because her collateral was stolen and ended up in someone's hands who never should have had it to begin with. I don't know anything about this incident with Frank Parlato and Nicole, and how Catherine Oxenberg was involved. I don't know anything about that. It seems very much like hearsay to me. It seems very much like an attempt, which I've seen the NXIVM loyalists do many times, to sort of sling mud at people who were instrumental in bringing NXIVM down. You see a lot of this mudslinging, and this is actually the smear campaign that's being kind of undertaken by NXIVM loyalists against people like Frank Parlato and Catherine Oxenberg, who they regard as like mortal enemies. But you see this sort of thing where they sort of make these accusations, and who knows, whether there's any truth to it. I don't really know. I don't know anything about this particular example, but I just think it's an interesting sort of example of how a lot of the NXIVM loyalists have tried to impeach the characters of those who have been instrumental in bringing the organization down. Another fact that has been ignored by purveyors of the salacious narrative is that the process to keep collateral secure involved keeping it in a safe that only one person had access to. Keith Raniere never possessed nor had access to collateral unless someone chose to send something directly to him. Well, we know that Alison Mack did send collateral to Keith. We don't know how much of it. We don't know whether anyone else sent collateral to Keith, but what we do know for sure is that Keith Raniere had access to a lot of the collateral. So clearly the process to keep the collateral secure was not that great. And Keith Raniere certainly could have commanded anyone to hand over collateral if he had chosen to do so. So, like, he was the Grand Master of DOS. And so if he had wanted anyone's collateral, I have no doubt in my mind that he could have gotten it. The goal was to keep each person's collateral safe and secure so it couldn't be mishandled or unintentionally leaked. The intention was to never actually release collateral. The intention was to inspire a sense of gravity and seriousness with regard to one's word so that it wasn't so easy to quit on oneself. Well, does it really matter what the intention was? I'm sure that there were women, possibly even most of the women or all of the women who joined DOS had pure intentions. I'm sure that they genuinely did think that they were doing a good thing and joining something that was going to be empowering, that was going to make them stronger, and that was going to be like a loyal sisterhood. But the intentions that it might have started out with really don't matter. All we need to look at were the actual consequences of what happened, what the outcomes actually were. You know, intentions are not a defense necessarily when you're talking about things like sex trafficking and, mutilation and all the various horrible things that went on in DOS, that I'm sure you're all aware of. So really, the fact that the intention was never to actually release the collateral and that the intention was just to use it as like a way to secure someone's promise or someone's word, I don't necessarily buy that as an excuse, because I think just a modicum of common sense would have told you that demanding very damaging information or resources from someone could have very harmful consequences. So really, to my mind, the intentions don't matter. Early on in DOS, a couple of women joined and then felt that the path wasn't for them. It was sad to think they could make such a strong commitment and then back out, but it would be wrong to want it more than they did. So they left and their collateral was never released or threatened to be released. Sometimes we'll do anything to get out of our commitments because it's too scary, too hard, too uncomfortable, but we are capable of so much more than our self-created constraints. I find it so interesting the way that they keep pushing this idea that the collateral was about a commitment. It was about pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, and that someone who didn't want to stay in DOS was showing that they were incapable of keeping their commitment, and that it was too scary and too hard and too uncomfortable. It couldn't possibly be because they objected to having Keith Raniere's initials branded on their pelvic region, or that they objected to having someone else tell them how much they were allowed to eat and making them feel shame if they broke this absolutely ludicrous diet that they were supposed to be on, or, that they didn't actually want to seduce Keith. And we have multiple women saying that this was an assignment that was set for the DOS slaves, seducing Keith, so that this was part of it. Now, I find it very convenient that that aspect is left out of this article. We haven't had a mention of that so far. That if someone had a problem with the assignment to seduce Keith, that would have been a perfectly legitimate reason for them to want to leave the group. No, it has to be because they just don't want to do things that are uncomfortable or scary or hard, or that they're incapable of keeping their commitment. The discomfort of giving up on ourselves when we've backed our word with collateral is intended to be greater than whatever adversity we might face on our path to success. It is in those defining moments when we can either quit or continue through the challenges. We have the opportunity to choose our higher selves and prove that we are capable of greatness. Is greatness also seducing the leader of the group? Is that also an example of greatness? Is greatness showing that you are able to exist on 500 calories a day? These are just questions that I would like answered and that I noticed this article doesn't attempt to answer. It's understandable that DOS has attracted critics, questions, and even controversy. Unfortunately, the truth has been twisted beyond recognition, and much that was intended to remain private between trusted friends has been made into a hostile public discourse. I do agree that the truth has been twisted beyond recognition, but I don't think it's been twisted beyond recognition by those who have exposed DOS. I think the truth has been twisted beyond recognition by those who are still loyal to these ideas. And I do just want to say that they have my compassion, because I truly believe that every woman who was lured into DOS, who joined DOS, including Alison Mack, was a victim at some point along the line. Yes, many of those women ended up being perpetrators as well. And this is something that often happens in high control groups, in cults. People start off as victims, and then by a slow process, they get turned into perpetrators as well. And that's just the tragic part about it, because then it makes it even harder to leave, because leaving means that you have to reconcile yourself with the things that you've done. It's the guilt and the shame. I can't even imagine the process of healing that people like Alison Mack and Nikki Klein have to, go through now in order to recover from all of this. Like, yes, they were perpetrators, and yes, they did awful things to other women. Danielle Roberts, as well, she's another one. She was the doctor who actually performed the branding, who lost her medical license because of it. These women, when they eventually wake up, will have so much healing and unraveling of all this stuff to do. It's just, I just kind of find it very, very tragic on so many levels. The perspective of the women who remain positive about DOS is not that the concept was perfect or the people involved infallible. Clearly not. But rather that DOS was created with good intentions, and the people involved were honest in their efforts to bring more honor, discipline, and personal responsibility to the lives of the women who decided to join. Again, as I've said, I do actually think that a lot of the women, if not all the women, joined with pure intentions. They wouldn't have joined if they'd known up front what they were getting themselves into, I don't believe. I think they genuinely believed in the honor of, the intentions of people who recruited them in to the group. I don't think any of them set out to become these sort of abusive, exploitative slave masters. But that's what some of them were turned into via the sadism and psychopathy of Keith Raniere. So yeah, I do think the whole thing is just really tragic. Unfortunately, DOS's history has so far been written by dishonest actors with personal agendas and weak character. Clearly, I think that it should be obvious by now, but I do not think that people who left DOS in any way, shape, or fashion had a weak character. In actual fact, I think it takes a great deal of strength to speak out about, a harmful cult and, a high control group. It takes a lot of bravery and strength to leave a group like that and to speak out, because it generally comes at a high cost to the person themselves, and also to have to admit what you've been part of and to go through the healing process. None of that is easy either. So I totally reject this idea that those people had weak character. That clearly isn't the case. The most tragic consequence is not just the damage to the women who wish to uphold their sacred vow and commitment to their fellow sisters, who are now wrongfully branded sex slaves, and worse. There is also tragedy in the damage to the principle of sisterhood itself. Well, I don't agree with that. I think friendship between women can, definitely exist outside of this concept of having to collateralize that friendship. I mean, I think the only friendship really worth having is friendship that you willingly and consensually enter into, and that a friendship between equals. And I think the whole concept of a master-slave dynamic within friendship is totally wrong. That's not really friendship. That's, a relationship between an abuser and a victim, if you ask me. So in my mind, the DOS sort of sisters were not in a sisterhood at all, really. It was something else, something that it was a twisted perversion of the concept of sisterhood and friendship. I'm not saying that they didn't get good things out of it, though, that friendships weren't formed. I'm sure that they did feel a measure of closeness and friendship amongst themselves, but that friendship and closeness was twisted and perverted for the desires of a man, namely Keith Raniere. Women who choose honor over hate and integrity over social acceptance should be celebrated. Women who choose victimhood over personal responsibility and delusions over truth should be helped. That is precisely what DOS was trying to do. Okay, so quite a bit to unpack in this final paragraph. Firstly, the use of the word hate. I didn't see any hate within the people who have been speaking out about DOS, except perhaps towards Keith Raniere, who caused a great deal of harm and damage to a lot of people, especially women. But ultimately, I don't think anyone was motivated by hate. I think the people who were trying to bring DOS down were very clearly motivated by a desire to protect and help the women who were a part of it and to prevent more people from being victimized. There was no hate, but I do think it's interesting. Cults and high control groups love to use the word hate to kind of tarnish the motives of people who criticize them. I think the other thing that's interesting is the use of the term social acceptance, the fact that they chose integrity over social acceptance. This is something we also see in high control groups and cults. People who are a part of cults and high control groups have a persecution paranoia. They believe that they are being persecuted by society and that they're misunderstood and that the rest of the world just simply doesn't understand them, and that if they did understand, they would think that what they were doing was actually really good. And so this is something I always find very interesting, is this idea of being sort of not socially accepted or not fitting in, or it's just because we don't fit in, it's just because we're not conventional. That's why people hate us. That's the sort of narrative that you see in a lot of cults and high control groups. The other thing is I can't help noticing that they they use this word victimhood to describe women who have spoken out about DOS, as if these women are weak, as if these women are choosing to be victims. Now, if you've seen the Vow and the Seduce documentaries, you will know that NXIVM had this bullet point in their mission statement about how there are no victims in life. I believe it goes, there are no ultimate victims, and therefore I will not choose to be a victim. So NXIVM, people who were, followers of NXIVM ideology didn't believe that there was any such thing as a victim, that, someone who was abused, raped, any sort of harm that was perpetrated against someone, that person ultimately brought it on themselves. And so that there's just no possibility of being a victim. And this is a concept that allowed Keith Raniere to get away with so much, because he could always just point to, well, I'm not victimizing you, you're victimizing yourself. And if you feel like a victim, that's a problem with you and not a problem with what I'm doing to you. So again, that's something I could probably talk about in a whole video, because that's something that the New Age movement also, it's a concept that we see in a lot of self-help and New Agey sort of philosophy as well. And finally, I have to bring your attention to the fact that they've used the word delusions, as if people who were speaking out about DOS were really the ones who were deluded, and that the people who remain loyal to DOS are the ones who are really in the truth. It's all a perversion. It's very 1984. It's very Orwellian, where, it's doublespeak. It's things have the opposite meaning from what they actually are. That's another sort of feature of high control groups. Cults flip everything on their head, so that black is white, nice is day, wrong is right. Victims are perpetrators, and everything is topsy-turvy and upside down, and you really just feel as if your brain has been completely tampered with and your sense of reality is completely warped. So that was the article. I've been talking for ages now and I am all talked out, but I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that you're enjoying this series, or that it's been thought-provoking for you. If you noticed any more interesting points from that article that I missed or didn't talk about, please feel free to comment on them down below. And I'll be back with another video about NXIVM probably fairly soon. There's a lot that I want to talk about when it comes to this group, and I find it really, really interesting, and I think we can learn so much about it and about cults and how they operate from seeing how people defend groups like DOS and NXIVM. It's just very interesting to me as someone who, is interested in studying undue influence. That's all I have for today, and I hope that you guys have a wonderful afternoon and take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.